Hey, Rondo's Kickboxing. This is Joshua Tiveridge here, sending you a heartfelt message all the way from South Carolina. I wanted to first give a big shout out to my good friend Christina. As some of you may or may not know, Christina and I go way, way, way back. She was my training partner and my sparring partner back when I was fighting, and I get to introduce her to Charlie, who ended up being her trainer, and then I get to watch her very, very special career. She did some amazing things, and it was an absolute pleasure to see what she's accomplished. And my heartfelt thanks goes out to her for doing this for my sister and my niece and I. As you may or may not know, so my niece Jaden, she's now 16. When she was 5 years old, she started to exhibit some pretty quick and onset neurological symptoms, kind of stroke-like symptoms. Her face drooped and she started dragging her leg, and this came on very, very sudden. And after a bunch of testing in multiple different hospitals, what they found was Jaden had an AVM, something called an AVM, arteriovascular malformation. What it is, it's this random growth of blood vessels and arteries that just kind of grows all on its own, and it grows kind of haywire. And they typically find these things in people's brains. And when they do, there's a bunch of different treatment options for it. Well, Jaden's happened to be in the middle of her spinal cord between C6 and C7 in her neck, right about here. And what happened is the AVM had ruptured, and it hemorrhaged inside of her cord, which created a lot of swelling and pressure, and gave her some neurological issues. What they had to do, so the way arteries work in your body, which I'm sure you guys know, is you have the blood flowing into the arteries, and the arteries run into a bunch of different systems, blood vessels and capillaries, that slow the blood flow and the blood pressure down, so that way it can be dispersed to wherever it needs to go. The problem with an AVM is those blood vessels and those capillaries, it bypasses all of that. So the blood flow inside this random growth of tissue is just massive. It's very, very pressurized. So when she was 5, what had to happen is the doctors went in and they removed her vertebrae, C6 and C7. They cut them the long way and took them off so that they could access her spinal cord, and they performed a surgery. They went in there and they removed as much of the AVM as they possibly could without damaging her spinal cord and all of her nerve endings. And then the way they described it was, if you can imagine a tree root growing into the ground around your nerves and all the things that make your body function from the neck down, basically. So they went in to try to remove as much as they could without giving her some permanent neurological issues. They could only remove some of it. There was no cure for an AVM, so they had put her back together, screwed her vertebrae back together, and this was just kind of a Band-Aid. Fast forward a bunch of years later, she's already defied the odds. She was able to compete competitively, gymnastics, and cheering. She's done cheering for her school. Then fast forward a bunch of years later, she started to get some symptoms again, some neurological issues. So they went in, and this time they were able. Her body was big enough she was physically big enough to where They went in through her artery in her leg, and they did what's called an angiogram, where they mapped it from the inside with the camera, and they saw where all the AVM was growing and around. And there was a new procedure where they were able to go in and do something called catheter embolization, where they go in and they put this very special glue inside the arteries to basically stop the blood flow to the arteries before the AVM could harm her. They went in and they were able to safely embolize one of the 3 main feeders that was feeding this thing, and it bought her some more time. Fast forward through March of this past year, right after COVID shut everything down. She's now 16 years old. She started to exhibit some pretty severe symptoms. My sister brought her back up to Boston Children's Hospital, and they did another angiogram, and what they found, pretty unsettling news, is they found that the AVM had grown, which they do. This one was a really, really aggressive AVM, so it was recruiting other blood vessels and veins and arteries and whatever's going on in your spinal cord to feed it. Well, it had grown from C6 to her brainstem, and it was now wrapped around her brainstem. And the issue now was, the worst case scenario was paralyzation. Now the issue was was life threatening. So what they did is one of the things that the doctors didn't know is they didn't know whether or not those two feeders at the brainstem, whether they had been there for a long time or they were pretty fast growing. So the game plan was to put her on a protocol where they were watching her. My sister's job basically was to stay home and keep an eye on her. If these two feeders were to bleed or rupture at the brainstem, it would have pretty much turned her off like a switch. So what they did was they had a protocol in place that if there was any sign of hemorrhage, my sister was to get her to the nearest emergency room where they would stabilize her, and they would medevac her to Boston Children's Hospital where they'd have to go in. But the game plan was they wanted to wait 2 months and then do another angiogram to see if the blood flow had increased or if these things had grown. Best case scenario is, again, these things were there for a long time. Worst case is they had grown pretty fast, which is what they were afraid of at the onset of her recent symptoms. She didn't make it the 2 months. She was having issues. She had to get back in there, and they found that the blood pressure had increased massively. So they had to go in and do something. What they were afraid to do prior, and due to the risk of the paralyzation, they were now having to go in there and do this in efforts to basically save her. So they went in just recently. This just happened. As a matter of fact, she got home from the hospital yesterday. So this is pretty good news. They went in on Thursday and they embolized one of the feeders. They can only do one because of the blood flow. So then they went in 2 days later and they operated. And when they were in there to do the embolization, they saw that the AVM there was a section of the spine where it had grown out of the spinal cord and then looped back into the spinal cord. So they had what I felt like was a Hail Mary pass. They were able to then 2 days later go in and clamp that feeder to stop the blood flow to it. They didn't know how much of the spinal cord this thing was feeding. So what they had done is they hooked Jaden's spine up to a bunch of different machines to measure electrical signal. Once they clamped the blood flow, if she were to lose any electrical signal in the spine, they would have to stop the procedure and release the clamp. Best case scenario is no loss of electricity in the spinal cord, and then they could cut and cauterize that feeder. But again, they had no idea how much, if anything, or if any, of the spinal cord this thing was feeding, or the brain. So this past Thursday, they went in, they clamped it, no issues with the spine. They cut it, cauterized it, sent her for a bunch of CAT scans and MRIs, and what they realized immediately after the surgery, the AVM had shrunk significantly, and it was just an absolute miracle. We felt this thing was coming to get her. So it was nothing but good news. So she's home. She got home yesterday. She does have some neurological issues. She's going to require a lot of physical therapy to get her back, to regain as much of that as possible. Nobody really knows because they just don't know how much blood flow she's lost to her cord. But the things are positive. What we felt was not good news, and now all of a sudden she's home and she can be a kid again. She can be a 16-year-old. So super happy. But I want to thank you guys for helping us out, and I know that Christina had sent this out to her school, and we want to just send you guys a heartfelt thanks. I appreciate it. Love you guys, and keep kicking. Keep doing what you guys are doing. Over and out.